So Canessa's been lucky to have some very, very unusual artists show, one a month for 54 years. This is one of the most incredible shows we've had. And it's a total accident. I didn't know Marie. I didn't even know her work. I just said, you ought to have a show. And then I found out later, well, the Chinese agree with me, and they're having her come over to China to have a show there. But the galleries in San Francisco don't do these kind of things because they're too unusual. So a prophet is never without honor save in her hometown. Marie?
That was really lovely. Thank you very much. Did you have some questions about this exhibit?
What happened was, after I saw the pictures of it, that was after I asked you about a show, I knew this was going to be wonderful, and it is. Well, yes, I'd like you to tell me how in the hell you got the Chinese to invite you to China.
Well, that was interesting. I was just doing my thing around the area, not right in San Francisco, but I go to a lot of meetings where there are other fiber artists, and there was a visiting person from China, Kelly Liang, and she's working on a PhD, and she was introduced to me by someone I used to do artwork with, and she said she'd like to interview me. She was going all over the world interviewing fiber artists. And she did more than 100 people, and she came to my house for an hour and a half and looked at my work and talked to me, and she said, well, if you get into, the first thing I did in China I had to apply for, she said, if you get in, will you come? And that seemed really important to her. So she suggested what I should enter. She had first her PhD show. I didn't go then, but I was in it. And then she told me what to ask for in the fall, and I got in and I went, and as soon as they saw my work, they actually, the head person from the university invited me to come to China, all expenses paid, and I did that in December.
So one thing that's happened here at Canessa is we seem to be global. Since I'm a mud turtle and I always stay home, I can't imagine being global. You're a global artist.
Oh, I've always liked to travel, so I like that, and the Chinese people were really good to me. Everything there that I did was connected to universities, and it was really special.
In the 50 years the gallery's been around, we've had an awful lot of graduates of the Art Institute. I didn't know it. Marie is almost graduate of the Art Institute, and I want her to explain where this art comes from.
Well, all my life I like to tell stories. When I was little, I lived in a foster home and everything was a secret. And so when I started, and there were lots of people that I really liked. I liked their characters and so on. I liked to tell stories about them. So I did that in photographs back in the 1980s when I was going to the San Francisco Art Institute. And I always wanted to go back to those stories. Had another job in between. So finally, in 2006, I was able to return to full-time art, and I started telling stories and using the materials that I learned to use when I was a child. And I saw some work that Lisa Kogan had done with buttons, and I didn't want to be just like her, but I thought I want to use buttons. And the reason is to unbutton those stories. And so with each piece, there's a person that I'm telling a story about, or a problem that I'm working out with the person who has that problem. And I work it through, because all of my work takes a long time to do. The smallest ones take about a month, and the big ones take about 3 months, and there's one here back that took 6 months. So, and I'm working hard all the time. So by the time I get to the end, I hope that there's somebody sees something and they see a story, but it doesn't have to be my story. I hope they see something, oh, I know Uncle Joe, and he's like that. Or
That's so great.
I saw a man once staring at one of my early pieces, and so I went up to him and I said, I see you staring, can I help you answer any questions? And that one was a tricycle, and then a girl who had no arms, and And that my story of that was that when I was little, I felt my only power was riding the tricycle, push those feet and everything. And he was standing there and he said, I was just thinking how wonderful tricycles are and how they're the power of the child. And that was my story, and he didn't even know he was telling mine. I chose to talk about this piece because, number one, it's my favorite piece that I ever made, and number two, this is a contemporary of the early Canessa building. This is my great aunt Thelma Combs, who was born in 1901. And she is a special example to me. She's the one who taught me to break the rules in knitting and don't follow the patterns and do what you think is right, because she was great at knitting. But she, when she was 18 years old, was accepted as first bass in the Women's Symphony in Chicago. Now, the men did not allow the women in the Chicago Symphony as that was, but the Women's Symphony was considered the best in the country and equal to men. And so she was very proud of that. But she needed to make a living, and so she went on to play bass in the jazz music of the Chicagos. And first she was with the women, but then she switched over and she was the only woman playing the bass. And then she was hired by MCA to be the band director of all the men. And that was great until 1929, but she always had trouble because they were insubordinate. So that was her word. They were so insubordinate, it was very hard to be a responsible musician who led a band. And so in the end, in 1929, just before the stock market crash, she fired all the men and ran away, which meant that she could never be hired again because all musicians in those days were controlled by the mob. So thus the broken instrument. She did play the bass in those days, but later she played the cello when she was old, and she went back to being a knitting instructor because she needed to make a life. But I tell that story because I think it was an important one, and there's much written about her now, but a very famous woman who was kind of ahead of her time, and now we're always talking about women having, whether they can be equal too, and that was her. Now this one is of a current event that we hear about all the time. We hear borders, borders, borders. And some of them are really sad stories. Some of them are happy stories that someone just wants to go and live in another country. And borders are such an issue right now that I had to look for my own border story, and I didn't have to go very far. This is my granddaughter, and she is half Mexican and half American. And in her case, it's a happy story and a sad story. Her father came over he was studying English and he needed to be fluent in English. He was studying international business. And he intended to go back to Mexico to live. That's what he wanted to do, and it is what he did it. And when he got back to Mexico, he was so sorry that he had met somebody he really loved in the United States. And so they kept going back and forth, back and forth. And finally he came up to the United States and they got married. And now he still wants to go back to Mexico, and so they're probably doing it soon. But in the meantime, here's my granddaughter who's half and half, and she's this is Texas. She's just she speaks both languages. She translates for everybody who needs it. And it's a different story about love crossing borders, and that's the name of it. This piece I'm especially close to because it took me 6 months. That's the longest I ever took on any piece. And a lot of that was research. I wanted to honor the women who have been successful in becoming really accomplished scientists in the world. And so starting with Hypatia, who was at the time of the Romans, all the way up to now, and all of the Nobel Prize winners who were women, are here and from so many countries. It's really surprising that they're countries that you never think of to associate as high-level scientists. Women have been accomplished. And the reason that I wanted to do it was partly because when I was in high school, I was told I should be a nuclear physicist, and I just laughed because I really liked math and science, but I couldn't imagine being that. And my daughter wanted to be a research chemist and had a lot of trouble in the lab with the men when she was doing that, and so she became a chemistry teacher. So this is my tribute to women in science and hope for the future.